Let's talk about argumentation. In the realm of philosophy, but not just philosophy, pretty much every academic discipline and even regular human conversation is really built around arguments, or at least the structure of communication between human beings, the kind of communication where you want to persuade someone to believe something or accept it, to get them to also believe the same thing. That is an argument. The basis of it is in logic. I've done another discussion where I talk about logic. I didn't go into a lot of elaborate detail defending the use of logic, but you'll see why logic is really a part of argumentation and normal everyday communication. So human reasoning can only be judged when it's put into the form of words. We can't read someone else's mind. We don't know what's going on in someone else's mind. We don't know how they're processing information. We don't know how they think through things in order to draw a conclusion. But as soon as their reasoning, their thinking is put into words, then we can evaluate whether or not it makes sense. So in practice, an argument is really the starting point of logic. It's the starting point of philosophy, critical thinking. It's the starting point of communication, especially persuasive communication. Now, many times when people hear the word argument in our culture, an argument is usually associated with negative things. I've mentioned this in another discussion. Argument is usually associated with emotional, heated debates where people are angry, upset, and, calling each other names. That's not what we mean by argument in the context of philosophy, critical thinking, or logic. What we mean by argument is simply when reasoning has been put into words. That's like a really easy way to understand what argumentation is. Now, later on, I'll give a more formal definition, but a basic, simple way to understand argumentation is simply when your reasoning has been put into words. And once it's put into words, then other people can evaluate it to determine whether or not it makes sense, it's based on good evidence, whether it's valid, it's rational, and that sort of thing. Now, your reasoning is put into words every single day. So in that sense, you are involved in argumentation every single day. And so once again, if you learn about critical thinking, argumentation, logic, and philosophy, then you can understand basic communication and basic argumentation that goes on around you all day long. It's going on between you and your cellie, or sometimes y'all call each other bunkie. It goes on between you and your family, you and the news reports, you and the newspaper, the books that you read. Argumentation is being done constantly because that's just how we communicate. So just keep in mind the simple definition for the moment that arguing or argumentation is simply when your reasoning has been put into words. Now, a visual image that you can think of when it comes to argumentation is that an argument can be understood kind of like a building or a house. All right. A lot of the language we use to discuss argumentation and logic and philosophy actually comes from the realm of architecture, masonry, carpentry. When we talk about, my evidence is based on this, that, or the other, the foundation of my argument lies in this area. This piece of evidence or this reasoning supports my conclusion. When we use words like based on, grounded in, supports, we're using language that refers to the imagery of building a building, constructing a building. So you can think of argumentation kind of like building a structure. A building is only as stable as its foundation. And so you can think of the conclusion to an argument or the thesis of a research paper, the main idea, whatever. You can think of it like the roof of a building. It is only as stable, it's only as good, it's only as grounded in how well the foundation is built. So when we're talking about argumentation, whatever the conclusion is only as sound, only as stable, only as foundational as the pieces of evidence, the reasons that are used to develop it. If your reasons and evidence are weak, your conclusion will be weak. Logic, critical thinking, these things are investigating how strong, how stable, how sound the reasons and evidence are. If the reasons and evidence are strong and stable, and the roof is secure, stable, and sound, then you can say that the argument is justified. Logic and different forms of critical thinking are trying to evaluate whether or not the evidence and the reasons used to support a conclusion are sound, are valid. If they are, then you can say that the argument is justified or that the conclusion logically follows from the premises. So when you have somebody who comes in and inspects a building, or not just a building inspector, but somebody who comes onto the construction site to inspect how the work is making progress, what they're doing is determining whether or not the foundation was laid appropriately, the load-bearing beams and walls were constructed appropriately, and if they are, then you'll pass the inspection. So also when it comes to an argument, if the evidence is sound, the reasons are good, then it will pass inspection. The roof or the whole structure will be deemed stable and sound, a good structure. So that's what you can think of when we're talking about argumentation. We're trying to make an argument, meaning that we are putting our reasoning into words, and the conclusions we draw in our reasoning, we want those to be valid, reasonable, sound conclusions. But they can only become valid, reasonable, sound conclusions if we lay a good foundation. And that good foundation, those load-bearing walls, are our evidence and our reasons. So that's what we want to do. We want to investigate whether our evidence and reasons are strong, are solid. All right? Now, here's a few basics involved in a good argument. And remember, a good argument, we're not talking about one that's heated, emotional, and trying to irritate people. We're talking about you have drawn a conclusion. You think other people ought to believe this. You're trying to persuade them to believe this. Or a book you're reading, a news article you're reading, the news on TV, or your cellie or somebody in visitation is trying to persuade you to believe something. And when they do that, they're making an argument. So here are a few of the basics when it comes to a well-rounded argument. So what makes up a good argument? You're going to hear different things depending on what book you read. There's a difference between arguments that are written down, like in an article or in a book, in a research report, and then an argument that you have, in regular verbal communication with people. But whatever you read, an argument has at least two parts. It has premises. Premises can also be called claims, and your premises or claims are different forms of evidence and reasons that you believe something or you've drawn a conclusion. And then the second part would be the conclusion. A conclusion can also sometimes be called your judgment or your interpretation. After you've looked at various forms of evidence, you've collected various reasons, all of these add up to a conclusion, a judgment, or your final interpretation or evaluation of something. So sometimes those terms are all used interchangeably, but they actually have a little bit different meaning depending on the context. But the point is, when it comes to an argument, it has at least two parts. The premises, sometimes called claims, and the conclusion. The premises, these are like the foundation, the load-bearing walls, the beams, and the conclusion is going to be the roof. The conclusion, especially if you're in like an academic writing or something like that, it might be called the thesis. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on a thesis later on, but sometimes the conclusion might also be called the thesis or the main idea or the main point. One of the things you will have to get used to in just academics, the more you learn about the world, whether we're talking about welding or biology or medicine, is that there are many things in the world that can be called by different names. So in this discussion, I will try to explain to you all of the different names something might have. So there are two basic parts to an argument, premises and conclusion. But the premises or premises might also be called claims. Reasons and evidence can be called premises or claims. And then when it comes to a conclusion, that also might be referred to as a thesis, a main idea, a main claim. It can also be called a judgment, someone's final interpretation or evaluation. You'll get used to these things as you think through them, but what are the two basic parts of an argument? Premises, conclusion.